Welcome to our final contribution to this e-conference following Jesus Matthew. For this session, we welcome back our two key speakers, the Reverend Dr. Dorothy Lee and also the Passionist priest, Father Chris Monaghan, to take questions that you have been sending to us. This session, though, is to be moderated by Carmel Duffy, who's actually been leading the development of adult faith education online for us here at the Broken Bay Institute. We thank so many of you who've taken part in our survey leading up to this service, which will be officially launched in February 2012. But right now, here to pose those questions to our guests, Carmel Duffy.
Thanks, Mike. It's wonderful to have all the questions that you've sent in, and I thank you for that. Before we begin, I'm wondering how you would like me to address you for this discussion.
Well, for my part, my Christian name is great, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Yes, same with me, Christian name.
Thank you, Dorothy. Our first question comes from St Peter's Anglican Church in Maroochydore, and I'll address it to you, Chris.
Okay.
How does the traditional image of Matthew the tax collector impact upon the Gospel of Matthew as the Gospel to the outsiders?
Well, one of my first reflections would probably be that, yes, Matthew is emphasised here very, very clearly as being a tax collector and clearly an outsider within the people of Israel. Generally, this is a gospel that is going to be highlighting outsiders when it comes to, like, the lost sheep of the house of Israel. A bit different to Luke's gospel, isn't it, Dorothy, where in Luke's gospel it is very much for the outsider, in terms of not just within Israel, but outside. So I'd say it's certainly there's an emphasis there, but not quite as strongly as Luke's gospel would have that. And I think that was brought out by in the first the e-conference on Luke that was brought out there. I think that'd probably be about enough on that one because we've got a number of questions to get through, haven't we?
Thank you. Dorothy, a question for you. Are you, or both of you have spoken today, implying that Matthew is inventing the truth?
Well, I'm certainly not trying to imply that. I think we'd be in big trouble if we thought that Matthew was making it all up. A couple of things. I think it's grounded, all the Gospels are grounded in history on the things that Jesus actually said and did. But each of them represents reflection over some years. Chris has talked about a 50-year period or something like that between Jesus and Matthew's community. Matthew's writing the gospel, and those 50 years, things are happening in those 50 years. People are interpreting, they're drawing out the meaning of things, and so that's one thing. The other thing is that Matthew has his own perspective. He's looking at the mountain from one angle, and that's the angle we get. So that's what we're trying to emphasise. There are 4 Gospels, not one. There's not just one interpretation of Jesus, but there are 4, and we're really blessed. And together, and along with the rest of the New Testament witness, that is where the truth lies, in the interaction between those diverse theologies. Truth lies in their interaction, in their harmonious witness to Jesus Christ.
Yes,
Thank you.
Exactly so. And I think the other side of that is that within our tradition, in the document on Revelation from the Second Vatican Council, we've talked about the Church speaking, that God uses the evangelists as true authors, true human authors. That's exactly what they are. And what we actually see is a more dynamic understanding of what inspiration will be. It includes what they've learned through the gift of the Holy Spirit, through the gift of that interaction with the risen Lord in the life of the church. And so in fact they're much more dynamic than purely just saying what Jesus said and did as though that's all there is. Because I think we have that ongoing dialogue within the tradition, in the history of the life of the church, that will continue.
Thank you. It's very interesting. I think a few speakers today cited Matthew 16 to 19. And I'll put this question to you, Chris. How do you see Peter as leader and the succession of Peter in relationship to all the Christian churches?
Well, that's a nice little tricky question. I don't know. One thing is very clear within the New Testament, and particularly for Matthew's Gospel, that Jesus sees leadership potential clearly in Peter, and the early church recognises. But mind you, Peter is the rock that crumbled. He's the one who will be brave enough to start to walk across the water, but when he feels the wind, he'll be the one who falls down. But I think it's a remarkable and a beautiful way of leading us into seeing Peter's leadership and the way the early church saw Peter's leadership. Yes, he was given first place among the disciples, among the apostles. And yet, what was given to Peter in chapter 16 is still going to be given to the disciples in chapter 18, to bind and to loose. So in a certain way, obviously in a limited way, we share in that too. The other part of the question, though, in relationship to all the Christian churches, I think all the churches will see that Peter has pride of place among the apostles within the New Testament. But our different traditions come to that in different ways, and I suppose that we deal with that in ways that we work very, very hard to be respectful of each other in all of this. But know that our tradition has a certain point of view about this which we honour, and sometimes it's a point of discussion among our different traditions,
Yes,
certainly.
that's right. It's the ongoing conversation, isn't it?
Ongoing conversation, very much so.
Thanks, Chris. Just picking up on your first talk today about the old and the new, one of the questions was, how does the discussion of old and new reflect Matthew's opinion of the use of tradition, whether it be either written or oral?
Well, one thing that we're sure, it's a good question, we know that the traditions of Jesus were preserved in a number of ways and continue to be preserved in written and in oral form. In comparing Luke to Matthew and comparing Matthew to Mark, we can see that Matthew has access to materials that the other Gospels do not have or have not chosen to preserve. So I think that dialogue is going on. And this is part of Matthew's process of bringing out those treasures new and old, respecting wisdom wherever it is found, wherever it comes, those treasures, I suppose, found buried in the field. Yeah.
Thank you. Times have changed, Dorothy, which we all know, but people haven't. They basically are the same. And the question is, why haven't people changed according to Matthew's Gospel? And I suppose some of that is regarding your talk about the Sermon on the Mount.
Thanks, Carmen. Yeah, I guess that's true that times have changed and human nature somehow stays the same in one sense. But I also think that for Matthew, there's a real sense that the fullness of new life won't come until the return of Christ. And that we do await that, and as we await it, we live mourning in a sense. We are those who grieve, and those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, including in ourselves. We grieve over the state of the world. We long for the kingdom of heaven to be realised in its fullness. And that's, I think, partly the answer that Matthew gives. I wouldn't, however, say that people haven't changed. I think there have been places in the world, in the life of the church, where the most extraordinary things have been done by Christians. And I wouldn't want to downplay those. Have been places, and there are places, there continue to be places where people are either doing dramatically wonderful things for the kingdom, or more likely doing very ordinary, loving things day after day that nobody ever sees. And their families know, perhaps nobody knows but God. And they are being faithful to the kingdom of God, the rule of God, and we don't see that. So we can't say that people don't change. People do change, but nonetheless we live with the hope of Christ's return.
Yeah.
And as we all know, we fall short sometimes, even
Yes,
though
we
we are trying to live out the
Yes.
gospel.
Yeah. And one of the things I'd add to that too is that Western culture has been so steeped in the values of the Beatitudes and of Matthew's vision that many times when we get people saying, look, I'm not a Christian, I don't have any faith values, but when you get talking to them, what are the values that they want to live by, or what they consider just to be human values, we'll find they are in fact the values of the Sermon on the Mount.
Yes, that's right.
So that's how I think, in fact, it has changed the world in the very way that we consider what's normal, what's best of being human.
That's beautiful, thank you. I've got a question from Mark Sinotta, and I might ask this of you, Chris. Why does Matthew's Gospel describe in such detail the death of John the Baptist, while the other Gospels don't?
Well, first thing we'd have to know is that Matthew does describe the death of John the Baptist, as in fact Mark does. So what I would say, though, is that Matthew is really concerned to tie the stories of John the Baptist and Jesus together in ways that are quite fascinating. And I'll just one little instance of it, I think. When John the Baptist is arrested, Jesus withdraws, and we wonder, what is Jesus going to do? He knows that, in fact, that preaching a message like John will lead to some degree of danger. And then what Matthew has done, he shapes the text that when Jesus re-emerges, it's exactly the same message as Jesus. So that's the first time. When John the Baptist has been killed, what Jesus' response is, he withdraws once again and goes over the other side of the lake. One imagines to wrestle with this great challenge. What must it be like if I continue to preach this message? And of course that's why, as you pointed out, the question of Peter, Lord, this must not happen to you, after he's proclaimed him to be the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's that problem, isn't it? Because, and Jesus says to him, you're a scandalon, which means a stumbling block. In other words, I could lose my way here, because the basic idea of sin is to go off the path. And so if that's going to happen, Jesus' message, Jesus' mission will not be fulfilled. So I think one of the why John is portrayed in such a powerful way in Matthew is to actually help us understand who Jesus is. Because when Jesus goes the other side of the lake to get away, what happens is the people are there and they draw out of Jesus his most beautiful response, I think. He has compassion on them because they're like sheep and they're lost and they don't have a shepherd. And that's precisely what Jesus is called to be.
It really highlights for me, I suppose, how skillful Matthew is
very
in
much so.
compiling this whole, every word has a great treasure, isn't it? That's what I've heard today.
Oh, great.
Yeah. We've got a question from St Mary's Parish in Dandenong, and I'll put this one to you, Dorothy. Was Jesus always perfect at every stage of his life? And what does perfection mean?
Well, the Church has always taught from the Epistle to the Hebrews that Jesus is without sin. And I think it's important to, it's perhaps a rather negative way of putting it, but it's important to hold on to that, because what we're saying is that our humanity is somehow remade in Christ, that Christ is the one who is truly human as well as truly divine. And that means he's not less than human. So in one sense I would say yes, but on the other hand I think that Chris was saying before that the Greek word for perfect is teleos, which means complete or whole. And while I think that Jesus was a person who was fully human, that doesn't mean to say that he didn't need to develop, that his awareness of himself didn't need to develop, of who he was, of his mission, that he didn't have moments, Mark's Gospel particularly gives us moments when Jesus perhaps, when the cup of suffering is held out to him, his first instinct is to shrink from it. So without being sinful, he's fully human. He's vulnerable, he's fragile, and therefore he develops. I mean, he learns from that greatest of all teachers, his mother. He has to learn Torah. He isn't born with a full knowledge of the scriptures. He actually has to develop. So while I would say he is without sin and therefore fully human, as a true human being, he has to learn and develop and grow in order to become teleos, to become perfect.
Yes, yeah. And that idea of being teleos, of perfect, complete, it's the idea of reaching the end, taking the journey to its end, and that's where Jesus shows the perfection, and that's where we're called to be perfect too, taking the journey. And also in that particular text about being perfect, it's interesting that Luke has to be merciful. As there's a little bit of a trouble for Luke. He thought, no, perfect might be a bit of a trouble for my community. But I think the other side of it is there that God reigns on the just and the unjust. And that's the kind of perfection we're talking about, being even-handed.
Yes.
I mean, that's a great challenge at any time. But I think that's the kind of perfection, and not a Greek idea of perfection, but a really dynamic process that we're invited into.
Yes, that's right. Being fully at one and wherever you are, fully present, I suppose, which is
Yeah,
what he was.
exactly.
Chris, there's a question here for you. How could Jesus speak to and be heard to 5,000 people?
Ah, yes. Well, this is the trouble these days, isn't it? I mean, any of us who try to preach anywhere would be thinking, how could you do that? But mind you, if you went to Ephesus, and some of you, I think, certainly some of our audience will have been there, there's a theatre there for 20,000 people. 20,000 people, no speakers, no microphones. And we were talking with Father Nick during the break there. He was saying that he takes groups to Galilee and the Mount of the Beatitudes, and there's a little bay in front of there, and water is a great reflector of sound. So there was a natural theatre. So there are possibilities. It's a great question, but there are possibilities using the natural acoustics of the area. I mean, sure, there's another side. How many people? Well, we're not exactly sure. But certainly Matthew wants to say that what Jesus is saying is for a huge crowd, for the world, of every time, of course. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
We've had quite a little bit of input today on righteousness, and this question, I think, takes on from your comments on that, Dorothy. What are the barriers of becoming righteous, and how can these be overcome? I suppose that's in relation to the Sermon on the Mount as well.
I mean, that's a good question. I'm not actually sure I can answer that one. I mean, there are a number of barriers to our being righteous. I mean, sometimes we're simply not aware that we are not righteous. You know, we sometimes don't have self-awareness. So lack of self-knowledge, self-awareness, I think, is one issue. And that is a lack of self-knowledge, not just as individuals, but as communities as well, that we don't always know ourselves. And that can be a barrier. I think our own stubbornness can sometimes be a barrier. Perhaps our own pride, our own inability to be poor in spirit, to recognise when we've failed. I mean, there's nothing better than recognising that we've done the wrong thing, because it's the only way to change. We need to have the humility to be able to say, yes, I did that wrong, I stuffed that one up completely. I need to pray for transformation, I need to work for transformation. So I think the barriers are complex. I think sometimes we make it hard for each other to be righteous. I'm not always sure that, I mean, we're quite a harsh, judgmental sort of people, aren't we, in very many ways? At least I know I am. And I think our constant judging of one another and constant criticising and sort of bitching and gossiping, I don't think that actually always makes it easy for others to become truly themselves, to become righteous. So I think we can put barriers in the way not only of our own selves but also of other people. And how can we overcome it? We've just got to hang in there. I mean, there is no other way. We've just got to hang in there and to pray, to confess, to be prepared to help each other and to work together. The main thing is not to give up, because God is so generous and forgiving in this gospel, indeed in all the gospels, that God always picks us up no matter what we've done. It's an incredibly radical message, and people need to hear it again and again, that the main thing is not to give up, because God doesn't give up on us.
And as Father Nicholas said, it's about trusting, isn't it? Trusting that just being on the journey will be led along.
That's right, yes. Yeah.
Righteousness might grow on us, hopefully.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Something we grow into.
That's right.
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Now, this is a topical question, Chris.
Okay, yep.
The question comes from Tom Gannon in Fremantle. Currently in Australia, as we face issues such as treatment of refugees and climate change, why are religious leaders and other people of faith so hesitant to see these Beatitudes as speaking to us as a prosperous nation about how we treat each other? And you both might like to have a comment to this. Yeah.
Well, and it was Tom's question, is it?
Yes.
Well, Tom, I'm not sure if I'm in a position to answer that question, other than to say really that the church in every age, as individuals, as leaders, we we are challenged by the gospel. The message of the Beatitudes is not an easy one. It does frighten us. We'd all love to think that we were able to respond with total generosity and without fear, without being constrained by our circumstances, by finances, by all sorts of considerations. But the fact of the matter is disciples of every age have to wrestle with this. But I hear your call for each one of us to be a lot more generous, a lot more trusting, as Dorothy was saying earlier. And I think hopefully one of the fruits of this day would be a greater awareness of the challenge to be people of the Beatitudes, to be people of the Sermon on the Mount.
I wonder also if there's another aspect to this, and that is, Chris, that I think for some Christians, at least in my denomination, probably not true of Catholics, but people tend to think that the Beatitudes refers, or the Sermon on the Mount only refers to themselves in their own personal life, that it doesn't have any implication for the way that we treat refugees, or that it has no, that we're really only on about saving souls. We're not interested in the whole bodily life of creation. And yet I think theologically we are concerned. God is the creator, and we are concerned about creation, and we are concerned about social issues. It's not just our individual salvation. So perhaps that's one of the reasons why not enough leaders in religious institutions are speaking out, although of course some are. But perhaps it would be good if more were.
I think sometimes it could be also they have spoken out, but it may not always be publicised, or we're not going to the places where those writings are.
I do think, I mean, this is perhaps a too general statement, but nonetheless I think it's got truth in it, and that is that the media, for the most part, only wants to hear bad news about the church. When a statement is published by the Anglican bishops or the Catholic bishops, it's much less likely to get media coverage than if somebody in a religious order or a religious institution has done something wrong, then that'll get front lines. But when the church leaders are trying to speak out on issues such as refugees, such as the environment, it doesn't get nearly as much publicity. I think the media in some ways is not that interested in what we're doing properly. They're only interested in what we're doing badly.
Well, they're criticised for influencing politics.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll just open this to either of you.
Sure.
Can you share some meaningful examples of individuals and communities worshipping Jesus as they go forth to make disciples of all nations? It's a hard one.
Meaningful examples. Well, countless, I suppose. I suppose, but one of the questions that we do have in this time of our history is not only making disciples of the nations and being disciples for the nations, but also respecting other traditions and other faiths. And that in itself puts us in a very different time and place. A respectful place, I think, is a very important thing. But when you're talking about making disciples of other nations, I've had a number of experiences in Papua New Guinea, for example, where it's just brilliant to be there when you've got young and old together, massive communities, and the different faiths just down the road, but everybody worshipping on a Sunday. They come to Australia and they say, "Oh, why all the grey hairs? Where are the young people?" But maybe that'll change after World Youth Day.
Do you want to say anything about that?
I can't just off the top of my head think of examples, and yet I'm aware of so many people who are doing so many wonderful things. As I said before, some of them just very quietly in a way that you wouldn't notice, and people that really are caring for those in need, caring for those who live in the streets, who are homeless, or people who at a political level are trying to transform structures, which is just as important. Some would even say more important. I like the way that the comment is worded, because it's quite right to see that what lies at the basis of it is worship, that it's worship and mission, they belong together, and I think there are many churches that are faithfully doing that in many ways, unseen, unheard.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and I think many ways we're working, being like yeast, as the gospel challenges us to be.
Which is hidden.
It's hidden. That's the point, but there and at work.
That's right, and very evident after its effect.
Yes.
We've got a question from Loretta from the Diocese of Maitland, Newcastle. How do we know how much faith a person has? I'll put this one to you, Chris. What is the measure? Surely we don't believe in a God who keeps an attendance sheet.
Yeah. So what's the measure? Yeah, so I've got my Geiger counter for faith right with me, just as quite polite. Now, it's a great question, though, isn't it? Because in Matthew's Gospel, what's there, I think one of the underlying not questions, but visions that Matthew has, that even a little faith is enough. And that's where the disciples come out that much softer in Matthew's Gospel than Mark, isn't it? Just a little faith will be enough. That's what the Lord, what our God works with. We bring what we have, and I think, isn't that the great miracle of the multiplication of the loaves? We've only got 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and that's all. The Lord takes that and blesses it, and it's enough.
Yes.
You know, that trust, and that's the way God works.
The grain
So,
of mustard seed.
The
isn't
mustard
it?
seed, exactly. So in many ways, a little faith, that's pretty much all that most of us have got anyway, but that's enough.
That's right. Thank you. Beautiful. There's a question here. How is Matthew's writing on fraternal correction practiced today in church hierarchy? In the clergy, like in cases of sexual abuse? Or does ecclesiastical disciplinary measure follow only after cases have been filed or exposed? That's a hard one.
It's a hard question, and I won't put the bishop under the collar there. I think it's really important to recognise and to admit, as the Church has done, as the Pope has done, that terrible things have happened, and it's saddened us. It's been a source of great grief that we haven't been as faithful as we should be. But I think it's really important for people to know that there's a whole set of protocols that have been enacted for some time. So the protocols that I would be working on would be such that if I hear of any matter that needs to be treated, it's not 70 times 7 in these instances, that in fact the protocols that we work in, I'm required to record and report, and that's in fact then taken up from there. So we can't avoid it, and there's no way that we should. But it's a terribly sad thing that might be the perception. And I think at a certain time, the Church was, as in many institutions, not really able even to admit that such things could happen. I know in the case of some priests that I know who just couldn't even imagine that one of their brother priests could ever have done anything like this. But the truth comes out, and the truth will set us free if we keep attending lovingly and with great humility to bring about the healing, which is so desperately necessary and so dreadfully late, I'm afraid.
And it's not just the writings on fraternal correction that we have to bring to here, is it? It's his whole teaching, with all the other aspects that you've mentioned today.
That one saying needs to be seen in the context of other sayings as well.
Thank you for that.
I mean, Matthew in chapter 18 says that, you know, whoever hurts one of these little ones, it would be better for them to, you know, have a stone tied around their neck and thrown into the sea. I mean, you know, their angels in heaven see the face of your Father in heaven, isn't it? And at the beginning of the chapter that Chris was speaking about before, it's a very serious thing to harm a little one in the Christian community, a very serious thing. But I would also say that there's so much good that the Church has also done, and there are many little ones who've been given life through the Church. So it's not the whole story.
Definitely not.
Thank you. I've got a question for you, Dorothy. It's from St Brendan's in Shepparton. Isn't it contradictory to Jesus' teaching of forgiveness that if we cannot reconcile, we should ultimately exclude or excommunicate?
That's a good question, that one. You could see it like that, and you could interpret it that way, but it seems to me that the way we interpret, and this is of course Matthew 18 again, that what Matthew's doing, I think Matthew's a lawyer,
Not a tax collector.
Not a tax. Well, maybe both. Who knows? Is it possible?
Oh, good tax collectors would have to be good lawyers, I think.
He's got a legal mind anyway. I think really what Matthew is saying there is that if you have done wrong to another and within the community you've done harm and you will not face it, when, you know, just one person tells you, when two or three, when the whole church says, look, and you've put yourself outside. I mean, Matthew's gospel, I know, is in some ways a very inclusive gospel, as is Mark's gospel, so is Luke and John in different ways, but they're not totally inclusive. There are those who stand outside and who willingly stand outside. And I think if you actually are in the position that you cannot admit you've done serious harm to somebody else in the church, when everybody is telling you that, then in a way you've excluded yourself. It's not so much, I mean, I would interpret it not so much as a mechanism of excommunication, so much as that you have actually put yourself outside of the community. You no longer belong because you're not prepared to be forgiven, to open yourself to God's forgiveness. So it's, I would interpret it more as a self-exclusion rather than getting into some of the things occasionally that churches have done in terms of excommunicating people.
Yeah. And I think that the other side of that is there's a dialogue that's not happening. It's a one-way conversation. The community keeps coming to the person and the person keeps saying no.
No, that's right.
Well, we've got a final question, and it's quite a brief one, so it's probably a good way to sum up. Please help us understand the distinction between apostle, disciple and follower as it is described in Matthew's Gospel, and that's from St Bridget's at How Long.
Okay.
Who would like to talk about
Well,
that?
I suppose when we're talking about apostle, we're talking about the 12 generally, though the word itself, an unusual word actually in the context of the Greco-Roman world, it comes from someone who is sent. And I think they were giving a primacy to the 12, but the word for apostle is actually used broader than that in the New Testament. In letters of Paul, all sorts of people will be called apostles. Including women, yes. And as in fact, yes, well, there's a lot of text we could go into, but we don't have time for that. So we've got that. So a disciple, the word for disciple is mathetes. It's a word to be someone who is taught, someone really who lodges in Jesus' school and takes his yoke upon on their neck. And then following is another word, which also, I suppose it comes from hearing, doesn't it? Hearing and following. So there are certainly different words there.
All with little facets of
different
the same
aspects
truth,
to the
I
dimensions
suppose.
in each one, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you all for the questions you've sent in today. I think they've really helped us depth out a little bit more on this whole issue of following Jesus in Matthew. Any final word?
Yes, I'd just like, I was given this lovely photo here and I'd just like to show it to you. This is St Mary's Greensborough and St Francis Xavier Montmorency, and I think they look like a terrific group of people, and it's been delightful to be able to talk to them today.
Yeah, so there've been
Thank
some of our companions on the journey, and I've got one here from De La Salle University in Manila. So that's quite a group there, isn't it? It's terrific. So welcome to you, and thank you for accompanying us on the journey.
Thank you.
Well, thanks indeed there to Carmel Duffy, who was leading the coordination of that question and answer session. Just a reminder that she is, of course, leading the development of Catholic adult education online here at the Broken Bay Institute, with that to be officially launched in February of 2012. It is time, of course, for thank yous pretty well across the board. We certainly do thank those who are with us today to wrap up the presentation, including Father Chris Monaghan, CP, the Reverend Dr. Dorothy Lee, also our visiting Jesuit priest, Father Nicholas King, and of course we also wish to thank our good friends John Garrett Publishing for their help with this conference. It is of course the end of the conference in some ways, but in other ways it could be seen as the beginning of some of the discussions that you may continue to have on the writings of Matthew. And looking further afield, we will have a further 2 presentations of e-conferences during 2012 from the Broken Bay Institute. All I can say on that front at the moment is watch this space. We will keep you informed, and we certainly hope that we continue to have your presentation and input into the presentations that we do. In the meantime, it is time for us to thank the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference and also the Broken Bay Institute for making this possible. We began our presentation today with a prayer from Bishop Peter Ingham on the south coast of New South Wales, and we are about to conclude with a prayer here from the Bishop of Broken Bay, David Walker. I'm happy to say that both of those bishops are very much involved with the Commission for Faith Formation within the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference. Bishop David.
Heavenly Father, we praise you, and we thank you for sending us Jesus, your Son, to be like us and to draw us to share in your divine life. We ask that your Spirit may guide us to be authentic disciples of Jesus and empower us to share with others the love that you have shown in Jesus. As always, we make our prayer through Jesus, your Son, and our Lord.